Before we begin, if you have not yet subscribed to this channel, please do so now. This is a story so extraordinary, so seemingly impossible, that even those who witnessed it could barely believe what they had seen. Comment below which city, state, or country you are watching from, and please, watch until the very end, because what happened on a blood-soaked cliff on a Pacific island in 1944 defies everything we think we know about courage, war, and the power of a single human voice. One 18-year-old Marine, alone and unarmed, convinced 800 enemy soldiers and civilians to surrender in a single day during one of the most brutal battles of World War II. This is not fiction. This is history. The island of Saipan rises from the Philippine Sea like a broken tooth, 15 miles long and no more than 5 miles wide at its broadest point, a landscape of volcanic rock, limestone cliffs, and dense tropical vegetation that conceals death in every shadow. In the summer of 1944, this small island became the epicenter of a strategic pivot that would determine the outcome of the Pacific War. American bombers launched from Saipan could reach the Japanese home islands for the first time. Tokyo knew this. Washington knew this. Every soldier, sailor, and marine converging on Saipan understood that the island was not merely territory to be taken or defended. It was the hinge upon which the war would turn. The invasion began on June 15, 1944, when the United States 2nd and 4th Marine Divisions, alongside the Army's 27th Infantry Division, stormed ashore under a curtain of naval gunfire that turned the beaches into a lunar hellscape of shattered coral and burning palm trees. More than 70,000 American troops poured onto Saipan, met immediately by 31,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors who had been ordered to defend the island to the last man. There would be no retreat. There would be no surrender. Imperial Japanese military doctrine had made this abundantly clear. To be captured alive was to bring eternal shame upon oneself, one's family, and one's emperor. Death in battle was glorious. Surrender was unthinkable, a stain that could never be cleansed. The Japanese commanders on Saipan, Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito and Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, the same Nagumo who had commanded the carrier strike force at Pearl Harbor, understood that they could not win. The Americans possessed overwhelming firepower, air superiority, and an endless supply of men and materiel. But victory was not the objective. The objective was to make the Americans pay for every yard of ground in blood, to delay them, to exhaust them, to kill so many that perhaps, just perhaps, the American public would lose its appetite for war. The Japanese soldiers dug into caves, fortified ridgelines, constructed hidden pillboxes, and interlocking fields of fire. They fought with a ferocity born not merely of tactical necessity, but of spiritual conviction. They had been taught that the Americans would torture and murder prisoners, that surrender meant degradation worse than death, that the only honorable path was to take as many enemy lives as possible before dying themselves. For 3 weeks, the battle raged with an intensity that shattered men's minds. Marines advanced through sugarcane fields where snipers waited motionless for hours, where a single misstep onto a concealed mine could obliterate an entire squad. They clawed their way up cliffs under machine gun fire, fought hand-to-hand in the darkness of caves, burned out bunkers with flamethrowers, and watched human beings turn to ash. The heat was monstrous, the humidity suffocating. Dysentery and tropical disease weakened men already pushed beyond endurance. The smell of death hung over everything, inescapable, a sweet rotten stench that soaked into uniforms and skin and lungs. By early July, the American advance had compressed the remaining Japanese forces into the northern tip of the island, a shrinking perimeter of cliffs and caves where thousands of soldiers and, horrifyingly, thousands of Japanese civilians had gathered. These civilians had lived on Saipan for years. farmers and shopkeepers and their families, and they had been told by Japanese authorities that the Americans were demons who would rape and murder them. That death was preferable to capture. Mothers held their children at the edge of cliffs. Families detonated grenades in their midst. People leaped into the sea from heights that guaranteed death upon impact. The Americans watched in horror, pleading through loudspeakers, trying to convince them that they would not be harmed, but the propaganda had done its work too well. Trust had been poisoned beyond recovery. And then, on July 7th, as the Americans prepared for the final push, the Japanese launched one last, suicidal attack. It began in the pre-dawn darkness, a Banzai charge of more than 3,000 men, soldiers and sailors and walking wounded, some armed only with bamboo spears and bayonets lashed to sticks, screaming as they surged forward in a human wave designed not to break the American lines but to die with honor. They crashed into positions held by the Army's 27th Division, overran artillery batteries, engaged in savage close-quarters fighting that left entire fields carpeted with bodies. The attack was a slaughter. By dawn, the Banzai charge had been annihilated. Thousands of Japanese soldiers lay dead. The survivors, broken and leaderless, retreated into the cave systems honeycombing the cliffs at the northern end of the island, a place that would come to be known as Banzai Cliffs, and further north, Marpi Point, where the cliffs rose sheer above the ocean. It was into this landscape of annihilation, on the morning of July 8, 1944, that Private First Class Guy Gabaldon walked alone. Gabaldon was 18 years old, a Mexican-American kid from the barrios of East Los Angeles, short and wiry, and utterly fearless in a way that seemed less like courage, and more like a fundamental inability to process fear the way other men did. He had grown up in a neighborhood where Japanese-American families lived alongside Mexican-American families, where cultural boundaries blurred in the shared struggle of immigrant communities trying to survive. Gabaldon had been taken in as a teenager by a Japanese-American family, the Nakanos, and lived with them, ate with them, absorbed their language not in a classroom but at a dinner table, in street conversations, in the casual intimacy of daily life. He learned Japanese the way children learn languages, through immersion and repetition and the necessity of communication. His Japanese was rough, informal, peppered with slang and street idioms, but it was real and it was functional and, most importantly, it sounded human. When the war came and the Nakanos were sent to an internment camp, Gabaldon enlisted in the Marines. He did not tell anyone about his language skills during training. He did not volunteer for intelligence work or translation duties. He wanted to fight. He wanted to be a rifleman, a Marine, indistinguishable from the men around him. But on Saipan, as the battle ground forward and the Marines began encountering Japanese soldiers willing to surrender, Gabaldon found himself pulled into interrogations, translating, negotiating. And he discovered something extraordinary. When he spoke to Japanese soldiers in their own language, not in the stilted formal Japanese of a textbook, but in the casual, human Japanese of the streets, something changed in their eyes. They saw him not as an enemy monster, but as a person who understood them, who could speak their words, who might possibly be trusted. Gabaldon began conducting unauthorized solo missions. At night, he would slip away from his unit and venture into no man's land, into areas still contested or nominally under Japanese control, and he would call out in Japanese, promising safety, promising food and water and medical treatment, promising that surrender did not mean torture or death. And soldiers came out, sometimes one or two, sometimes a dozen. He would lead them back to American lines, turn them over to intelligence officers who were astonished that a teenage Marine was capturing prisoners in double digits. His commanding officers were furious. then baffled, then grudgingly impressed. One captain finally told him, "If you are going to keep doing this insane thing, you might as well do it officially." Gabaldon was authorized to operate independently as a lone scout, a designation almost unheard of in the Marine Corps, where men fought in squads and units, and the idea of a single Marine wandering enemy-held territory was tactically absurd. But Gabaldon was effective. Over the course of the Saipan campaign, he had captured dozens, then hundreds of Japanese soldiers and civilians. He had a gift for reading fear, for understanding when someone was on the edge of surrender, for knowing what words would break through the indoctrination and the terror. He promised them dignity. He promised them life. And when they surrendered and found that he had told the truth, that they were given food and water and medical care, that they were not beaten or executed, word began to spread among the remaining Japanese that perhaps surrender was not the unthinkable horror they had been taught. On the morning of July 8th, Gabaldon stood at the base of Banzai cliffs alone. Above him, honeycombed into the limestone and volcanic rock, were caves packed with Japanese soldiers and civilians, hundreds of them, possibly more than 1,000. They were surrounded, cut off, without supply or hope of rescue. The Banzai charge had failed. Their commanders were dead. The choice before them was simple and terrible. They could wait in the caves until the Americans came with flamethrowers and explosives and burned or buried them alive. They could charge out and be gunned down. They could walk to the cliffs and throw themselves into the sea. Or they could surrender, which every ounce of their training and belief system told them was worse than any death. Gabaldon knew that the caves were going to be assaulted. He knew that the standard procedure was to call for surrender, wait a brief interval, and then methodically destroy every cave entrance, sealing or incinerating everyone inside. It was brutal, but it was effective, and it saved American lives. But Gabaldon also knew that inside those caves were not just soldiers but families, children, elderly people who had been caught in the machinery of a war they never wanted. He knew that if he could reach them, if he could speak to them, he might be able to stop the killing. He carried no weapon. He had a canteen of water and a few ration bars. He had his voice and his rudimentary Japanese and a faith, irrational and absolute, that he could make this work. He began to call out. His voice echoed off the cliffs, rough and urgent. He shouted that the war was over for them, that there was no escape, that the Americans did not want to kill them but would if forced to, that surrender meant safety, food, water, medical care. He shouted that he was alone, that he was unarmed, that if they wanted to kill him they could, but that if they listened, he could save their lives. Silence answered him. The heat pressed down. The cliffs were white in the morning sun, jagged and unforgiving. Gabaldon kept shouting. Minutes passed, then an hour. His throat grew raw. The sun climbed higher. And then movement. A figure appeared at one of the cave mouths, cautious, terrified. A Japanese soldier, rifle in hand, staring down at this lone American who stood exposed and vulnerable, shouting promises in broken Japanese. Gabaldon did not move. He kept talking. He told the soldier that he understood fear, that he understood the shame they had been taught to feel, but that shame was a lie and life was real, that their families needed them alive, that honor was not found in pointless death but in survival. The soldier hesitated. Others appeared behind him, shapes in the darkness of the cave, watching. And then the soldier lowered his rifle. Gabaldon felt his heart hammering against his ribs. He gestured for the soldier to come down. Slowly, agonizingly slowly, the soldier descended, followed by another and another. They reached the base of the cliff and stood before Gabaldon, haggard and filthy and trembling with exhaustion and terror and the unbearable weight of what they were doing. Gabaldon spoke to them quietly. He asked if there were others. They nodded. Many others. Soldiers and civilians hiding in the caves, waiting to die. Gabaldon made a decision that should have gotten him killed. He asked the soldiers to go back into the caves and bring out anyone who would listen. He asked them to tell the others that surrender was real, that the American-speaking Japanese was real, that they would be treated with humanity. He sent enemy soldiers, armed and desperate, back into the caves, trusting that they would return, trusting that they would not simply shoot him from the cave mouth or organize an attack. The soldiers disappeared back into the darkness. Gabaldon waited. The sun beat down. He could hear distant gunfire from other parts of the island, the rumble of artillery, the whine of aircraft overhead. He was utterly alone in a war zone, standing at the base of a cliff honeycomb with hundreds of enemy combatants, waiting to see if his trust would be rewarded or if he had just made the last mistake of his short life. And then they began to emerge. At first a trickle, a few soldiers, unarmed, hands raised, then more. Then civilians, women clutching children, old men stumbling on the rocks, teenagers wild-eyed and shaking. They came out of the caves in groups of 5, 10, 20, a stream of humanity that grew and swelled until the base of the cliff was crowded with Japanese soldiers and civilians, hundreds of them, standing in the sun, staring at the young Marine who had promised them their lives. Gabaldon moved among them, speaking constantly, reassuring, organizing. He told them to sit, to stay calm, to wait. He sent more soldiers back into the caves to bring out others. The crowd grew. 300, 400, 500, they kept coming. Some wept. Some sat in stunned silence. Children cried. Wounded men groaned. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, infection, fear. And then a Japanese officer emerged. He was older, a captain or perhaps a major, his uniform torn and stained, his face gaunt with hunger and the moral agony of what he was about to do. He approached Gabaldon and spoke in formal, clipped Japanese. He wanted assurances. He wanted to know that his men would not be executed, that the civilians would be cared for, that surrender would not mean the dishonor and death they had been promised. Gabaldon looked him in the eye and gave his word. He promised that everyone would be treated according to the rules of war, that the wounded would receive medical care, that families would not be separated, that there would be food and water and shelter. He promised that surrender was not the end of honor but the preservation of life. The officer held his gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded. He turned and shouted an order into the caves, and the final groups emerged, soldiers and civilians who had been waiting for their leader's decision, who would follow him into surrender as they would have followed him into death. By mid-morning, approximately 800 Japanese soldiers and civilians stood at the base of Banzai cliffs, the largest single group of prisoners taken by one individual in United States military history. But Gabaldon's mission was not finished. He now had to get them to American lines without being killed by his own side. He organized them into a column. He found a white cloth, possibly a torn shirt, and tied it to a stick, creating a makeshift flag of surrender. He placed himself at the front of the column and began to walk, leading 800 enemy soldiers and civilians across open ground toward the American positions. If any Marine sentry, any nervous rifleman, any tank crew saw this mass of Japanese moving toward the lines and opened fire, it would be a massacre. Gabaldon was gambling that he could get close enough to be recognized, to shout in English, to make the Americans understand that these were prisoners, not attackers. They walked in silence. The sun burned overhead. The landscape was scarred with shell craters, littered with the debris of battle, bodies bloating in the heat. Gabaldon held the white flag high and prayed that some trigger-happy Marine did not decide to be a hero. And then American voices, shouting, weapons raised, orders screamed to halt. Gabaldon shouted back in English, his voice cracking with strain, identifying himself, explaining what was happening, begging them not to shoot. There was confusion, disbelief, officers running forward to see what impossible thing was occurring. A lone Marine, a teenage kid from East Los Angeles, standing at the head of a column of 800 Japanese who had just surrendered. The prisoners were taken into custody. They were searched, separated, processed. Intelligence officers swarmed over them, extracting information about troop positions, fortifications, supply caches, information that would save American lives in the final days of the battle. The civilians were given food and water and medical care. The wounded were treated. Families were kept together. Gabaldon had kept his promises. When his commanding officers demanded an explanation, Gabaldon shrugged. He had seen an opportunity. He had taken it. What was the alternative? Kill them all. He had saved American lives by preventing a prolonged cave-clearing operation. He had saved Japanese lives by offering an alternative to suicide. He had done what needed to be done. The Battle of Saipan officially ended on July 9, 1944, one day after Gabaldon's extraordinary surrender negotiation. The cost was staggering. Nearly 3,000 Americans killed, more than 10,000 wounded. Of the 31,000 Japanese soldiers and sailors on the island, fewer than 1,000 survived. The rest died in battle, in Banzai charges in the caves, or by their own hand. Between 8,000 and 10,000 Japanese civilians died, many by suicide, entire families choosing death over the imagined horrors of American captivity. The cliffs at the northern end of the island, where so many jumped to their deaths, became known as Suicide Cliffs and Banzai Cliffs, monuments to the human cost of propaganda and fanaticism. But in the midst of this carnage, Gabaldon had shown that another way was possible. Over the entire Saipan campaign, he personally captured or facilitated the surrender of more than 1,300 Japanese soldiers and civilians, an astonishing number that earned him the Navy Cross, later upgraded after decades of advocacy by those who witnessed his actions. He was 19 years old. Gabaldon's story is not simply a tale of individual heroism, though it is certainly that. It is a story about the power of language to bridge the chasms that war creates. Every Japanese soldier who heard Gabaldon speak heard not the formal, distant Japanese of a military translator, but the casual, human Japanese of a friend, a neighbor, someone who saw them as people rather than targets. That distinction mattered. It created a space where trust could exist, where the inhuman calculus of kill or be killed could be interrupted, where men facing certain death could choose life without destroying their sense of self. It is also a story about moral courage in its rarest form. Gabaldon was not brave because he risked his life, though he did so repeatedly. He was brave because he chose compassion in a context where compassion was seen as weakness, where the easy path was to step back and let the machinery of war do its work. He walked unarmed into situations where he could have been killed at any moment, and he did so not because he was ordered to, not because he sought glory, but because he believed that the people in those caves deserved a chance to live. The institutional Marine Corps did not know what to make of Gabaldon. He violated protocols, ignored orders, operated outside the chain of command, and yet produced results that no one else could match. He was reprimanded and decorated simultaneously, a living contradiction to the doctrine that wars are won through discipline and adherence to procedure. But the men who fought alongside him, the officers who saw what he accomplished, understood that some situations demand not obedience but initiative, not firepower but empathy, not the hammer but the extended hand. In the years after the war, Gabaldon returned to a country that did not quite know how to remember him. He was Mexican-American in an era when minority veterans were often forgotten, when the narrative of World War II centered on white heroes and ignored the contributions of Black, Hispanic, Asian American, and indigenous soldiers who had fought with equal courage. He struggled with post-traumatic stress, with the weight of the things he had seen, the faces of the people he had saved, and the faces of those he could not. He fought for recognition, not for himself but for the principle that what he had done mattered, that the lives he saved had value, that there should be a place in history for the man who chose to talk instead of shoot. Eventually, recognition came. His Navy Cross was upgraded. His story was told in books and films, though often with the embellishments and distortions that Hollywood demands. But the essential truth remained. On a cliff on Saipan in the summer of 1944, an 18-year-old Marine armed with nothing but language and courage convinced 800 people to choose life over death, to trust an enemy, to believe that there was a future beyond the war. The lessons of Gabaldon's story are not comfortable ones for those who prefer war to be simple, who want clear lines between good and evil, friend and enemy, us and them. His story insists that even in the midst of total war, even when fighting an enemy indoctrinated to suicidal fanaticism, there are alternatives to annihilation. It insists that language matters, that cultural understanding matters, that seeing the humanity in the enemy is not weakness, but the highest form of strategic and moral intelligence. It insists that one person, acting with courage and compassion, can change the course of events, can save hundreds of lives, can create a space for mercy in a landscape of slaughter. The caves of Saipan are still there, silent now, empty. The cliffs still rise above the Pacific white stone against blue water. Tourists visit, take photographs, read plaques that explain the battle in sanitized language that cannot convey the horror of what happened. But if you stand at the base of Banzai cliffs and imagine the morning of July 8, 1944, you can almost hear a young voice calling out in rough Japanese, promising safety, promising life, asking for trust. And you can imagine the first tentative steps out of the darkness, the first choices for life over death, the beginning of a surrender that should have been impossible. Gabaldon proved that war does not have to be a binary choice between victory through annihilation and honorable death. He proved that there is a third option, harder and more dangerous than either, requiring more courage than charging into gunfire. The third option is to walk alone into the space between armies, to speak to the enemy as a human being, to offer a bridge where everyone else sees only an abyss. He proved that sometimes the most powerful weapon is not the one that takes life, but the one that preserves it, not the rifle but the voice, not the order to fire but the plea to listen. In the end, the 800 people who walked out of those caves did not surrender to the United States Marine Corps. They surrendered to the possibility that the world could be different than they had been taught, that the enemy could be trusted, that life could continue beyond the moment when all hope seemed lost. They surrendered to a teenager from East Los Angeles who spoke their language and saw their humanity, and refused to let them die when there was another way. That is the story of Gabaldon. That is the story of one man, one voice, one impossible day on an island in the Pacific. That is the story we must remember, not because it makes war seem noble or easy, but because it reminds us that even in the darkest circumstances, individual choice matters, compassion is possible, and the courage to be human in the face of inhumanity can change the world. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Share your thoughts and reflections on Gabaldon's incredible act of courage in the comments below. What do you think about his decision to walk unarmed into those caves? Could you have done the same? And please, let us know in the comments where you are watching from, what city, state, or country you call home. Stories like this deserve to be remembered and shared. Thank you for watching until the very end.